Hello, fourth grade. It is Monday, the 1st of June, 2020, and this is our language time. We're going to start talking a little bit today and tomorrow about adverbs. So we learned about adjectives, which we know describe nouns, person, places, things, or ideas. And now we're going to look at adverbs, which for the most part describe verbs, okay? So just like we found out that the adjectives answered questions like whose, how many, how much. Hang on, I'm checking some really quick. Just like we talked about that with adjectives, that they answered questions. Which one, what kind. Adverbs answer the questions how, when, and where. How, when, and where. Okay, so we're starting Unit 11. We're going to at least introduce you to it, and we will learn more about it next year in 5th grade for sure. So we're on page 183, recognizing adverbs. So I'm just going to read this with you. It says, the fifth part of speech, which you will learn, is the adverb. Like an adjective, an adverb describes. An adjective describes a noun or pronoun, like I just said. An adverb is a word that describes a verb, an adjective, or another adverb, okay? For the most part, in general, it's going to be describing a verb. And most adverbs end in ly, okay? Not all, but most. You'll have to see how it's used in the sentence, all right? So here's some examples. She spoke softly. Look at the word softly, it ends in ly. This adverb softly describes the verb spoke. It answers a question, how she spoke. She spoke softly. The next one, the horse is very big. Very, almost, always, those are always adverbs, okay? So whenever you see the word very, know that that's an adverb. The horse is very big. The adverb very describes the adjective big. So that's an example of an adverb describing an adjective. Okay, it's giving us details about how big was the horse. The horse was very big. And the last example is an adverb describing another adverb. It says he talks too fast, T-O-O. Okay, that is always an adverb. Just like very is always an adverb, the word to, T-O-O, is always an adverb, meaning how he talked, too fast, okay? So the adverb to describes the adverb fast. So that's an example of an adverb giving details about another adverb. Again, I want to go over those three ways that an adverb works. Describes a verb, describes an adjective, or another adverb. First example, she spoke softly. Softly giving us details about the verb spoke, or describing the verb spoke. Second one, very. The horse is very big. That's an example of an adverb describing or giving us details about an adjective. Answering the question, how big? Very big. The third one, an adverb giving us details or describing another adverb. He talks too fast, okay? So adverbs describe verbs, like I said, more often than they describe adjectives or other adverbs. So that's what I said a few minutes ago. I said most of the time you're going to be seeing adjectives describing or giving us details about verbs. They answer the question how, when, and where. Adverbs which describe action verbs often tell how the action is done, like she spoke softly. How did she speak? The verb spoke. She spoke softly. See how many adverbs can describe the verbs walk, eat, and read. So look at here where it says walk. These are some examples. Slowly, can walk slowly. Quickly, fast, carefully. Silently if somebody's trying to sneak up on somebody, play a joke on them or something, okay? So a lot, like I said, a lot of your adverbs will end in ly when they are giving you details about a verb. So those are just some examples of how somebody can walk. Eat, the verb eat, neatly, messily, politely, hurriedly, meaning in a hurry. And you see, again, all of those words in that example end in an ly. Okay. Read. Well is an adverb. Fast, poorly, haltingly. Haltingly means if somebody's struggling to, like a small child, if they're struggling to sound out the word, their reading might be choppy. Okay. So all of those are adverbs. Like I said, most of them end in ly. Not every adverb's end in ly. Too is an adverb. Many, much. Those are all adverbs. Like I said, very, and they don't fast. We saw them use fast twice in walk and in read. So it's not always going to end in an ly, but most of the time they do. All right. It says, did you notice that many adverbs end in ly? I'm reading the look closely. It says, check ly words to see if they are adverbs. They probably are. Which of these ly words is an adverb and which is an adjective? Okay, so I said most li words will be adverbs, but some will be adjectives. You have to look at this sentence and see, is it giving us details about a verb, an action, or about a noun? Okay, so look at your examples. My neighbor is friendly. Okay, that friendly is an adjective describing neighbor, giving us details about neighbor. But look at the next one. My neighbor works skillfully. Your verb is works, and it's giving us details about how your neighbor works skillfully. Therefore, in that example, it is a action. Works is an action word, so it is an adverb. It's giving us details about the action word works. Okay, first one, my neighbor is friendly. Adjective describing neighbor. Neighbor is a noun. My neighbor works skillfully. Skillfully, adverb describing the way your neighbor works. Okay, which is a verb. All right, so it's an adverb. Okay, so let's look at page 184. 184 and 185, you're basically going to do be doing the same thing. You're going to add a few important identification marks on page 185. But in 184, this is what you're doing. It says to find an adverb easily, first find the verb. Say the verb and ask where, when, how often, and to what extent. So the ones I put on the board was how, when, and where. Okay, to get you thinking about those. Going to answer the question how, when, and where. But there are also two other questions that they're telling us on page 184, and that is how often. I'll try to put it down here. How often and to what extent. And I'll explain to you what that means when we see it in an example. Okay? So just like the adjectives answered questions like whose, which one, what kind, how many, how much. Adverbs answer questions when, we talked about that, how, when, where, how often, and to what extent. Okay, so when you find a word that you think might be an adverb, ask yourself, does it answer one of those questions? So, a word which answers one of these questions is an adverb. Here are some examples. I went inside. Inside is an adverb describing where you went. And Ellen came yesterday. Yesterday is an adverb. Yesterday, today, those will always be adverbs. Tomorrow, always adverbs. So Aunt Ellen came yesterday. Yesterday answers a question. Question came when? Joshua did his work sloppily. Sloppily is an adverb telling us, where are we? Did how. He did sloppily, okay? And that's giving us details about the verb work. Showed us how he worked. Samuel is always prompt. Always is an adverb describing how often. Always. And this is almost finished. Almost. Like I said, words like almost, always, what else they say? Must, to, T-O-O, and very, today, tomorrow, yesterday, those will always be adverbs that answer one of those questions. So here we have, this is almost finished. Finished is your verb, so almost is giving you, describing that verb, giving you details, and it answers the question, to what extent, okay? So if you see a word like almost, or well, that's such a good example, I'm just gonna stick with that. I don't wanna confuse you. So you see a word like almost, that tells you to what extent, almost, okay? So all you're doing in Think A is you're going to write which question is being answered by the word in italics. So here, I've showed you, here's an example. You have the word radiantly is in italics. I'm just going to underline it. And yesterday, so the sun showed radiantly. Does that answer the question how, when, where, how often, or to what extent? Okay, so you ask yourself, radiantly, sun shone. Shone is your verb. How did it shone? So it answers the question how. So you would write the word how, question mark, in the blank. It is answering that question. How did it shine? It shone radiantly. Okay? The next one, we went to church yesterday. Yesterday is your word in italics. And that answers the question how, when, where, how often, or to what extent. That answers the question when. So you would write when in the blank with a question mark. Okay? So all you're doing in numbers 1 through 10 is you're writing which question it's asking. Look at number 4. It says, we should fully obey our parents. Fully is your adverb. It's in italics. That would answer the question. I want to give you another example of to what extent. That would answer the question, to what extent. Okay? We fully. It doesn't answer how, when, where, how often, and to what extent. It answers how, it answers to what extent. Okay? We should fully. All right? It's close to how often. I mean, I could see how you could use, it could be, both of those questions could be answered by the word fully, but how often isn't strong enough. Okay? It's more of a concept thing, okay, than an exact. So if I say, I teach 5 days a week. How often do you teach 5 days? I could give you an exact number. Whereas to what extent is more of a concept. We should wholeheartedly give ourselves to the Lord. To what extent? Wholeheartedly. We should show kindnesses, okay? Kindnesses. Kindness is an example of a word that you could put an adverb in front of, okay? We should fully show kindnesses every day, okay? We should, I'm trying to think of another adverb to use for that. But it would, to what extent would be a word that you can put in front of kindnesses that is more of a concept than a particular number of days. We're going to show kindnesses 3 days a week. Okay, that would be how often. Okay, but to what extent is more conceptual, and a concept is more like of an idea. Fully, wholeheartedly. Okay. Let's see. Let's do a where. So look at number 5. A flock of geese flew overhead. That answers the question. Where did they fly? They flew overhead. Look at number 8. It says it seldom snows in Florida. Okay. That you could look at that and you could think, well, that's kind of a concept. It doesn't give a particular amount of days, but that's actually answering the question, how often? Seldom. Okay. So the to what extent and the how often can get confused. I hope I'm not confusing you now. We'll talk more about it if you are confused. That's not my intention. But seldom snows in Florida. That would be more, even though it's a little bit of a concept, like how much is seldom? Is there a number on seldom? It's close enough to the number like several, which means three or a few more. So it would be closer to how often, okay? Fully is more everything in you, opposed to, which is more of conceptual than seldom, meaning you can think, well, I know that several means about between 3 and 5. So that is more specific. So how often would fit that better, okay? Look at number 10. I will come immediately. Does they answer how you'll come, when you'll come, where you'll come, how often, to what extent? That would be when. I'm coming right now. Okay, I'm coming immediately. So write B says write 3 adverbs that tell when. So think about that. Write 5 adverbs that tell how. Write 3 adverbs that tell where. Okay. Now, on page 185, think C, you're going to do what you did here where you wrote the question that it answers of how, when, where, how often, and to what extent. It's going to be one of those 5. On page 185, you're going to circle the adverb, and you're going to underline each verb 2 times and circle the adverb and then see which question it's answering. So I'm going to do this in red. So our first one says, man is wonderfully made by God. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to circle my adverb, giving me details about the verb made. So, well, no, let's find the verbs first. That's probably a little easier. So my verbs are is made, and my adverb that gives me details about is made is wonderfully. So I circle wonderfully, okay? And then I'm going to answer the question. Man is wonderfully made by God. And that answers a question. How, when, where, how often, and to what extent. Okay, that would answer the question, how. How is man made? Man's wonderfully made, okay? So again, you identify the verbs, okay? You circle the adverb, and you write the question that the adverb is answering. Number 2 says, the pine boards were cut here in our town. Okay, so our verbs are were cut. Our adverb is here. Look for the word that answers one of these questions in regards to the noun. Were cut. Where were they cut? That answers the question where, here. So you'd write where in the blank. Okay, again, the pine boards were cut here in our town. Find your verbs. Were cut. Find the word that gives us details, here. It answers, which word answers one of these questions. We know that here answers where. Were cut. The verbs were. That gives us details about those verbs. Where? Look at number 3. 4 pigeons descended softly upon the roof. Okay? 4 pigeons descended softly upon the roof. All right? So let's find our verb softly. I'm sorry. I gave you the adverb. Descended. That's our action, which means they came in for a landing, so to speak. And then softly gives us information, details about descended, and it answers a question, how, when, where, how often, or to what extent. It shows us that they descended softly. So that answers the question, how. How did they descend? They descended softly. Okay? Look at number 4. Says we could hardly see the distant star. So our verbs are could and see. Our adverb is hardly, answering the question, to what extent? To what extent could we see? We could hardly see it. Okay. I want to give you another to what extent. Look at number 21. It says George Washington Carver greatly helped the Southern farmers. You're going to learn about that in 5th grade. So we know that our verb is helped, so we underline helped twice. We circle the word greatly, that's giving us details about our verb helped. And greatly would be to what extent. That's a really good example because you can't really fit, because sometimes, like I said, to what extent and how often, they can both kind of fit, but greatly could not fit with how often. How often greatly? No, that doesn't make sense. But it could fit with, obviously, to what extent? Greatly. Okay? Here's another to what extent. Look at number 12. That new store is almost completed. That new store is almost completed. Your verbs are is completed. Okay? You underline those twice. You circle the word almost. That's your adverb, giving us details about completed. And it answers the question to what extent. We're almost finished. All right? It's almost completed. So that gives us an example of to what extent. Almost. So here we saw our adverbs that gave us details on page 184 and 185 that answer the question to what extent in regards to the verb that it's giving us details about. In number 4 on page 184, it was fully. I want you to hear these words that are like to what extent. Okay, so we have fully, we have hardly, we have almost, we have greatly, and so those are words that are to what extent. Like I said, we can get not confused, but we can not be quite confident when do we use how often and when do we use to what extent. And so I keep telling you that to what extent is going to be a word that gives details about the verb, which is more like a concept. Fully, greatly, hardly. Okay, what was our last one? What's that? Fully, greatly, hardly. And almost. Okay, so if you have questions about that, and when do I use, if there's a particular adverb that you found the adverb and you're not sure if it's to what extent or how often, see how specific it is. Is it more specific or is it more a concept? Okay. I hope I didn't confuse you. It's hard to kind of put into words. So I'm doing the best I can, but I'll walk you through it. We'll work through it. And the more we practice, the more we get used to it. And we'll be able to tell the difference right away. Okay. So that's what you're doing today. You're doing pages 183 to 185. Just getting our feelers into adverbs and what adverbs are. Again, in conclusion, they answer the questions. They describe the verbs and answer the questions and give details. They answer the question how often, when, where, how, and to what extent. Okay? And like I said, we cannot be real confident when is it how often and when is it to what extent. Look at how it's used in the sentence. For example, could hardly see. To what extent could I see? Not how often could I see. I hardly. No, could. Think about the how it's used in the sentence. Another one was greatly helped. Not how often. Does greatly answer the question how often? No. Greatly answers the question to what extent did he help? greatly helped. Look at we should fully obey. To what extent should we obey our parents? Fully, not how often. That doesn't make sense. How often do we obey them? Fully. So look at how it's used in the sentence. Okay. And then almost. Almost was another one. It says is almost completed. To what extent is it completed? It's almost completed. That wouldn't work. How often is it completed? Almost. That doesn't, it's not as strong. So you have to, when you put it in the context of the sentence, you'll have a better understanding and you'll know right away when to use to what extent and when to use how often, even though they are kind of similar. Okay? All right. I hope I haven't confused you. If so, we'll work through it. Give me a call.